"Sir, I'm going to need to see your boarding pass again, and some additional identification." Those words hit Kelvin Jackson like a punch to the chest as he stood in the first-class aisle of Flight 447, his hands starting to tremble. Not from fear, but from 30 years of rage he'd learned to keep buried deep inside. What happened next would cost this airline $2 billion and change an entire industry forever. But to understand the nuclear explosion that was about to detonate in that airplane aisle, you need to know exactly how they got here. Because the woman blocking Kelvin's path to seat 2A had no idea she was about to destroy her own life. Kelvin reached into his jacket pocket, his fingers shaking as he pulled out his boarding pass for the third time. First class, seat 2A, clear as day. But as he handed it over, something inside him snapped back to being 8 years old again, following his mother through a department store while security guards trailed them like they were criminals just for existing. He could feel every passenger's eyes burning into his back now. Some were recording with their phones, others whispered to each other. A businessman in 1B was openly staring, his expression a mixture of curiosity and judgment. An elderly woman in 2B clutched her purse tighter, as if Kelvin's presence somehow threatened her safety. And in that moment, standing in that aisle, Kelvin realized his life was about to change forever. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. This was about every time he'd been randomly selected for additional screening at airports across the country. Every time a TSA agent had patted him down while waving white passengers through. Every time he'd been asked if he was really qualified for MIT when he showed up with perfect SAT scores and a 4.0 GPA. Every time he'd walked into a boardroom and felt the weight of proving he belonged there, while his white counterparts were simply assumed to deserve their seats at the table. Before we continue with this story, if you stand against prejudice and racism, hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens in the next 45 minutes will shock you. And you need to hear every single word. The flight attendant's name tag read Melissa Daniel, and she was looking at Kelvin's identification like it was written in a foreign language. His platinum frequent flyer card, earned through hundreds of thousands of miles of business travel. His company credit card, a Black American Express that most people only dreamed of qualifying for. His driver's license, issued by the state of California to one Kelvin D. Jackson, CEO. All bearing the same name, all legitimate, all real. But none of it mattered to her, because in her mind, someone who looked like him didn't belong in first class. Melissa held his boarding pass up to the light, examining it like a detective studying evidence of a crime. She squinted at the barcode, ran her finger along the edges as if checking for signs of forgery, and even pulled out a small UV light. A device Kelvin had never seen used on any other passenger's documentation. "This boarding pass looks unusual," she said, her voice dripping with suspicion. "The paper quality seems different from our standard issue." Kelvin stared at her in disbelief. "Ma'am, I printed this boarding pass from your airline's website this morning. I checked in online exactly 24 hours before departure, just like I've done hundreds of times before." "Look, sir," Melissa said, her voice now carrying an edge of impatience. "I don't know how you got this boarding pass, but these seats are for our premium customers. Maybe someone at the gate made a mistake and felt sorry for you." The words hung in the air like poison. Felt sorry for him. As if his success was charity. As if his achievements were handouts. As if a black man in a first-class seat could only be there through pity rather than merit. Kelvin felt the familiar fire rising in his chest. The same fire he'd felt every time someone questioned his qualifications. Every time someone assumed he was a diversity hire. Every time someone looked at his accomplishments and wondered how he'd really earned them. "Ma'am," Kelvin said, his voice dangerously calm, "I paid for this seat. My company paid for this seat. I've been flying first class on this airline for 8 years. I'm a Platinum Elite member with over 2 million miles." Melissa rolled her eyes, and said, "Sir, I find that hard to believe. People like you usually fly. Well, Just stay in the back of the plane where you're more comfortable. People liked you. The phrase echoed in Kelvin's mind like a gunshot. The businessman in 1B was now openly recording with his phone, but not in support. His expression suggested he was documenting what he assumed would be Kelvin's eventual removal from the cabin. The elderly woman had pulled out her cell phone too, probably texting her daughter about the incident she was witnessing. Have you ever been in a situation where someone judged you before they even knew who you were? Drop your story in the comments below, because what happened next proves that sometimes karma comes with compound interest. The supervisor was walking toward them now, and Kelvin could see the determination in her eyes. She was going to double down on this mistake. And that's exactly what he was counting on. To understand who Kelvin Jackson really was, you need to know his story. Because understanding his journey is the only way you'll comprehend the nuclear bomb that was about to detonate in that airplane aisle. He wasn't born into money. Hell, he wasn't even born into stability. Growing up in Detroit during the city's decline, his mother worked 3 jobs just to keep them afloat. She cleaned offices at night, wiping down the desks of executives who made more in a day than she made in a month. She worked retail during the day, standing on her feet for 8 hours while customers treated her like she was invisible. And she did people's hair on weekends, hunched over kitchen sinks in neighbors' apartments, her back aching and her hands cracked from chemicals. Kelvin remembered sleeping on their neighbor's couch when the lights got turned off, pretending he wasn't hungry when there wasn't enough food, and the burning shame of using those free lunch tickets at school while other kids paid with real money. He remembered the way the lunch lady would hold up the line to examine his ticket, as if she needed to verify that he truly qualified for charity. But the worst part? Watching his mother's hands crack and bleed from all that cleaning, knowing she was killing herself just to give him a chance. She would come home at 2 a.m. with her uniform stained and her spirit broken, but she would still sit with him at the kitchen table, helping him with homework by the light of candles when they couldn't afford electricity. When Kelvin was 10 years old, his father sat him down in their cramped living room and said, "Son, I can't do this anymore. This poverty, this struggle, this feeling like I'm drowning every single day. I'm not strong enough. You're the man of the house now." And then he walked out. Just like that, packed a single duffel bag, and left Kelvin to comfort his crying mother and pretend he understood what being the man of the house even meant when he still needed help tying his shoes. That night, as his mother sobbed in her bedroom, Kelvin made himself a promise. He would never, ever let his family struggle like that again. And he would never let anyone make him feel small because of where he came from, what he looked like, or how much money his family didn't have. So he worked. At 12, he was bagging groceries after school. At 14, he was washing dishes in a restaurant kitchen. At 16, he was tutoring other kids in math and science, charging $5 an hour and saving every penny. But it wasn't just about the money. Kelvin threw himself into his studies with the desperation of someone who knew that education was his only way out. While other kids were playing video games, he was at the library. While they were watching TV, he was coding on an ancient computer he'd bought with his dishwashing money. While they were sleeping, he was studying for AP exams that would determine whether he could get into a good college. At 17, he sat across from his college admissions counselor, a middle-aged white woman named Mrs. Patterson, who looked at his perfect SAT scores and said, "Are you sure you're really qualified for MIT? I mean, these scores are impressive, but maybe you should consider a state school. Somewhere more appropriate for someone with your background." Kelvin stared at her in disbelief. "My background? You mean my 4.0 GPA? My perfect SAT scores? My National Merit Scholarship? Or do you mean something else?" Mrs. Patterson shifted uncomfortably. "Well, you know, affirmative action programs can sometimes create unrealistic expectations. I just want to make sure you're setting yourself up for success, not failure." That was the first time Kelvin truly understood what he was up against. It wasn't enough to be good, he had to be perfect. It wasn't enough to be qualified, he had to be undeniably exceptional. And even then, people would still question whether he truly deserved his accomplishments. Jackson Technologies started in his MIT dorm room with $1,000 he'd saved from working in the cafeteria. While his classmates were partying, he was coding. While they were sleeping, he was networking. While they were taking spring break trips to Cancun in Europe, he was building something that would make sure his mother never had to work 3 jobs again. His first investor meeting was a disaster. He walked into a conference room full of white venture capitalists who took one look at him and decided the meeting was over before it began. "So, Mr. Jackson," one of them said, not even trying to hide his skepticism, "what makes you think you can compete with established tech companies? Do you have any experience in business management? Any track record of success?" Kelvin had prepared for this question. He pulled out his laptop and launched into a detailed presentation about his company's revolutionary data analytics platform, his projections for market growth, his plans for scaling the technology. But he could see in their eyes that they weren't really listening. They were just going through the motions, probably taking the meeting as some kind of diversity checkbox exercise. "This is all very impressive," another investor said when Kelvin finished. "But we typically invest in founders who have a certain cultural fit with our portfolio companies. We need people who can golf with our executives, attend our charity galas, represent our brand in the right social circles." Cultural fit. Another way of saying people like us. Kelvin left that meeting empty-handed, but more determined than ever. He would prove them wrong. He would build his company without their money, without their approval, without their permission. And he did. Jackson Technologies grew from a dorm room operation to a multi-million-dollar company in just 5 years. Kelvin worked 18-hour days, fueled by the memory of his mother's bloody hands and the promise he'd made to that scared 10-year-old boy who became the man of the house too young. Standing in that airplane aisle with Melissa Daniel treating him like a criminal, Kelvin realized something that cut deeper than any childhood wound. Success hadn't changed anything. Money couldn't buy respect. Achievement couldn't erase the color of his skin. The supervisor approached, Janet Morrison, and Kelvin could already see the script playing out in her head. He'd lived this movie 1,000 times. "What seems to be the issue here?" Janet asked, but her eyes were already fixed on Kelvin like he was the problem. Janet Morrison was in her 50s with the kind of stern expression that suggested she'd spent decades dealing with difficult passengers. Her uniform was crisp, her hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her posture screamed authority. But when she looked at Kelvin, her expression wasn't just authoritative, it was suspicious. "This gentleman claims he belongs in first class," Melissa said, emphasizing the word gentleman with obvious sarcasm. "But honestly, Janet, look at him. Does he look like he can afford a first-class ticket? He's probably some kind of... well, you know what I mean." Janet nodded knowingly, as if she and Melissa were sharing some secret understanding about the kind of people who really belonged in first class. "Sir, I'm going to need you to show me proof of purchase for this ticket," Janet said, her voice carrying the tone of someone who was used to being obeyed without question. "A receipt, a credit card statement, something that shows you actually paid for this seat and didn't just find this boarding pass somewhere." The implication was clear. They thought he'd stolen it. "Furthermore," Janet continued, crossing her arms and taking a step closer to Kelvin in what was clearly meant to be an intimidating gesture, "our first-class section is for business professionals and elite travelers. I'm not sure you understand the kind of clientele we serve in this cabin. These seats cost $3,000 each. That's more than most people make in a month." The condescension in her voice was so thick, you could cut it with a knife. She was speaking to him like he was a child who had wandered into an adult space, like someone who needed to be educated about his place in the world. Kelvin's hands trembled as he reached for his phone. Not from fear, but from pure rage. 30 years of this. 30 years of proving himself over and over again. 30 years of being treated like an imposter in his own life. "Let me guess," Kelvin said quietly, his voice carrying a dangerous calm that made several nearby passengers look up nervously. "You need to verify that I'm not using a fraudulent credit card? That I'm not some kind of criminal who somehow managed to trick your system? That I'm not running some elaborate scam to get a free ride in first class?" Melissa smirked, actually smirked, like she was pleased that Kelvin understood the situation. "Well, you said it, not me. But since you brought it up, yes, we do need to verify your identity and payment method. It's standard procedure for unusual situations like this." "In fact," Janet added, pulling out her radio, "I think we should call security just to be safe. We can't be too careful these days." The businessman in 1B leaned forward in his seat, clearly enjoying the show. "Finally," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear, "someone's doing something about this." If you stand against discrimination, hit the subscribe button, type justice, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Please share this video to encourage someone. That's when everything changed with a voice from seat 3B. "Excuse me, I'm recording this entire interaction, and what I'm hearing is absolutely disgusting." Kelvin turned to see Patricia Luo, a woman in her 30s, with tears streaming down her face. She held up her phone with shaking hands, the screen showing that she was indeed live streaming to Facebook. "I'm a Stanford PhD in computer science," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I work for Google as a senior software engineer. And last month, United Airlines told me my English wasn't good enough for business class, even though I was born in California and speak better English than half their staff." Patricia's story came pouring out in a rush. "They made me prove I could afford my ticket. They questioned whether my credit card was real. They treated me like I was some kind of fraud just because I'm Asian and was sitting in business class. And now I'm watching them do the exact same thing to this man." Her live stream had started with just a few viewers, probably friends and family. But as she continued speaking, the viewer count began climbing. 10 viewers, 20, 50, 100. "This is 2024, Patricia continued, her voice getting stronger. "We shouldn't still be dealing with this kind of blatant discrimination. This man has shown you his boarding pass, his ID, his credit cards. What more do you want? DNA evidence? A letter from his mother?" But Melissa Daniel was doubling down. "Ma'am, please put your phone away. This is a private airline matter, and you're interfering with our security protocols." "Private?" Patricia shot back, her viewer count now approaching 200. "You just accused this man of stealing a boarding pass and implied he's a criminal, in front of a cabin full of passengers. How is that private?" "Furthermore," Melissa continued, her voice rising, "we don't appreciate passengers who try to intimidate our crew with recording devices. This kind of behavior is exactly why we have these security concerns in the first place." That's when Melissa made the comment that would end her career. "Look, lady, I don't know what kind of diversity hire situation you people have going on, but this is a business, not a charity. We cater to real professionals, not people playing dress-up in business suits they probably can't afford." The cabin fell silent. Even the businessman in 1B, who had been enjoying the spectacle, looked uncomfortable. An elderly woman in 2C audibly gasped. Patricia's live stream viewer count jumped to 500, then 1,000. "Diversity hire. You people. Playing dress-up." Each phrase was like a nail in Melissa's professional coffin, and she was the one hammering them in. The cockpit door opened, and Captain Christopher Anthony stepped out. He was a distinguished-looking black man in his 50s, with gray at his temples and the kind of commanding presence that comes from decades of experience. The moment his eyes met Kelvin's, 400 years of shared struggle passed between them. Captain Anthony had been listening to the commotion from the cockpit, and his expression suggested he'd heard every word. He'd probably lived through his own version of this encounter more times than he could count. But Melissa wasn't done. As the captain approached, she actually said, "Oh great, here comes another one. What is this, some kind of setup? Did they plan this?" The implication was clear. She thought this was some kind of coordinated effort by black passengers to create a scene. As if two successful black men on the same flight was somehow statistically impossible. Captain Anthony's jaw tightened, but his voice remained professionally calm. "Melissa, I need you to step aside immediately, and I need you to apologize to this passenger for your completely inappropriate comments." "Apologize?" Melissa laughed bitterly, and it was the kind of laugh that suggested she thought the world had gone completely insane. "For what? For doing my job? For maintaining the standards that make this airline profitable? These people need to understand that not every space is meant for them." These people. The words that would haunt her forever. There it was. The mask completely off. No more coded language, no more subtle implications. Just raw, unfiltered prejudice broadcasted to Patricia's growing audience, which had now swelled to over 2,000 viewers. Because what Melissa Daniel didn't know was that Kelvin Jackson owned 15% of Meridian Airlines through his investment fund. What she didn't know was that in 6 hours, he was supposed to close a $200 million acquisition deal with the company that employed her. What she didn't know was that her prejudice was about to cost her everything. But Kelvin wasn't ready to reveal his trump card yet. He wanted to see how deep this rabbit hole went. He wanted to document every moment of discrimination, every prejudiced comment, every assumption about his worth based on the color of his skin. "You know what?" Melissa continued, emboldened by what she perceived as Janet's support. "I'm tired of this. I'm tired of having to pretend that standards don't matter anymore. I'm tired of acting like everyone deserves to be here just because they show up with a boarding pass they probably got through some diversity program or affirmative action lawsuit." Janet Morrison was nodding along, apparently agreeing with every word. "Melissa's right. We have protocols for a reason. We have standards. And if that makes us racist, then so be it. At least we're honest about it." Another career-ending soundbite, captured in high definition and broadcast to an audience that was growing by the minute. Patricia's phone was shaking in her hands as she continued live streaming. "Are you hearing this?" she said to her audience. "They're not even trying to hide it anymore. They're openly admitting to racial discrimination." The comment section on her live stream was exploding. Viewers were tagging news outlets, civil rights organizations, and social media influencers. Screenshots were being taken. Videos were being shared. The incident was going viral in real time. David Walsh, the white executive in seat 1A, was squirming in his leather seat like his privilege was suddenly too tight. He'd been trying to ignore the situation, hoping it would resolve itself without requiring him to take a stand. But the blatant racism was becoming impossible to ignore. "Excuse me," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the commotion. "What?" Melissa snapped, clearly irritated by another interruption. "I think you should apologize to this gentleman," David said, his voice growing stronger. "What you're saying is completely unacceptable." Melissa turned on him with the fury of someone whose worldview was being challenged. "Oh, so now you're going to lecture me too? Let me guess. You're one of those liberal white guilt types who thinks we should just throw open the doors and let anyone sit anywhere, regardless of whether they belong." "I think people who pay for tickets should be allowed to sit in the seats they purchased," David replied, his voice steady, despite the confrontation. "It's really that simple." "Simple?" Melissa laughed again, but this time it was tinged with hysteria. "Nothing about this is simple. Do you know how much training I've received about security protocols? Do you know how many potential threats I've been taught to identify?" The implication hung in the air like a toxic cloud. She was suggesting that Kelvin's race made him a security threat. By now, Patricia's livestream had attracted over 3,000 viewers, and the comments were a mixture of outrage, support, and calls for action. People were sharing their own stories of discrimination, creating a digital community of shared trauma and solidarity. Kelvin's phone was buzzing with notifications. His assistant Lisa was calling frantically. News outlets were sending direct messages. His company's PR team was in crisis mode, but he remained calm, documenting everything, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal the truth about who he really was. You know what the real problem is? Melissa continued, apparently unaware that she was digging her own grave with every word. It's that these people think they're entitled to everything just because of their skin color. They think the world owes them something. They think they can just show up and demand equal treatment without earning it. Captain Anthony had heard enough. Miss Daniel, you are completely out of line. Your comments are inappropriate, unprofessional, and potentially illegal. I'm ordering you to apologize to this passenger and return to your duties immediately. You're ordering me? Melissa's voice rose to a near shriek. You're going to side with them over your own crew? What happened to supporting your team? I support crew members who do their jobs professionally, Captain Anthony replied coldly. I don't support discrimination or racism in any form. That's when Melissa made her final, fatal mistake. Fine, she said, her voice dripping with venom. But don't come crying to me when this airline gets sued because we let these thugs into first class and something happens. Don't blame me when our real customers stop flying with us because they don't feel safe anymore. Thugs. The word that would end not just her career, but any hope of future employment in the service industry. The live stream exploded. The viewer count jumped to 5,000, then 10,000. Screenshots of Melissa's comments were already being shared across Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. #Meridian Airlines racism was trending. Patricia was openly crying now, but she kept the camera steady. This is 2024, she said to her audience. This is what discrimination looks like. This is why we can't stop fighting. That's when they heard it. The rapid clicking of heels, power walking down the jet bridge. Patricia Stone, CEO of Meridian Airlines, had arrived at Gate 47 looking like a woman watching her empire crumble in real time. Patricia Stone was in her early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of polished appearance that came from decades in corporate leadership. She'd built her reputation on running a modern, inclusive airline. She'd given speeches about diversity and inclusion. She'd implemented training programs and hired consultants and won awards for her company's progressive policies. And now she was watching it all fall apart because of one racist flight attendant and one enabling supervisor. Mr. Jackson, she said, slightly out of breath from running through the airport, I am so incredibly sorry. Miss Stone, Kelvin interrupted calmly, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years of suppressed anger. Your employees just spent 30 minutes questioning my identity, suggesting I stole my boarding pass, calling me a charity case, implying that people like me don't belong in first class, referring to me as a thug, and openly admitting to racial discrimination. Tell me, is this the company culture we're about to merge with? Patricia Stone's face went white as she realized the full magnitude of what had happened. She was a smart woman who understood the implications immediately. This wasn't just a customer service failure. This was a public relations nuclear bomb that would destroy years of careful brand building. Furthermore, Kelvin continued, his voice growing stronger, your crew suggested that I was some kind of security threat, that I had obtained my ticket through fraudulent means, and that I was part of a coordinated effort with other black passengers to create problems for your airline. By now, Patricia's live stream had attracted 15,000 viewers. The story was being picked up by news outlets. Celebrities were starting to share the video. Politicians were beginning to weigh in. But Melissa Daniel still didn't understand the gravity of the situation. Even as her CEO stood there apologizing, she muttered, I was just doing my job. These people always play the race card when they get caught. That comment, caught on the live stream, heard by 15,000 people, recorded for posterity, was her career suicide note. The phrase, these people, would follow her for the rest of her life. It would be quoted in news articles, included in case studies about workplace discrimination, and used as an example of how not to treat customers. "Miss Daniel," Patricia Stone said, her voice ice-cold and deadly calm, "you are terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the premises, and you will never work for this airline or any partner airline again. Your comments have violated every policy we have about customer service, diversity, inclusion, and basic human decency." Terminated? Melissa's face went pale as the reality of the situation finally hit her. "But I was following protocol. I was protecting the airline." "You were engaging in racial discrimination," Patricia Stone replied firmly. "And you did it in front of thousands of witnesses while being recorded live. You've not only violated our company policies, you've potentially violated federal civil rights laws." But the damage was already done. Within hours, Melissa's comments had been viewed millions of times. Her name, her face, her words, all permanently etched into the internet's memory. She would never work in customer service again. No airline would hire her. No hospitality company would touch her. No business that served the public would risk the liability of employing someone with her documented history of discrimination. Melissa Daniel had committed career suicide on the world's biggest stage, and she didn't even realize it until it was too late. The internet is forever, and her 15 minutes of infamy would follow her for the rest of her life. Every future employer would Google her name and find the video. Every job application would be rejected. Every interview would be cut short. She became unemployable in an industry built on serving diverse customers. Her prejudice had made her toxic to any business that valued its reputation. Janet Morrison met a similar fate. Her comments supporting Melissa's discrimination were equally damaging to her career prospects. Within a week, she too was terminated and blacklisted from the industry. But the story was just beginning. Because what none of them knew was that Kelvin Jackson wasn't just another passenger. He wasn't just another victim of discrimination. He was the CEO of Jackson Technologies, owner of 15% of Meridian Airlines, and the man who held the future of their company in his hands. The revelation came during Kelvin's press conference 3 hours later. Standing in front of a wall of cameras and microphones at the airport's media center, Kelvin looked directly into the lens and said, "My name is Kelvin Jackson. I'm the CEO of Jackson Technologies, and I own 15% of Meridian Airlines through my investment fund." The room erupted. Reporters shouted questions. Camera flashes exploded. The story had just become 10 times bigger. "Earlier today," Kelvin continued, "I was scheduled to close a $200 million acquisition deal with Meridian Airlines. That deal would have made my company the majority owner of their technology division and given us significant influence over their operations." He paused, letting the implications sink in. But after experiencing blatant racial discrimination from their employees, after being called a thug and a fraud, after being told that people like me don't belong in first class, "I'm putting that deal on hold pending a complete review of their company culture and hiring practices." The stock market reacted immediately. Meridian's shares, which had already dropped 12% during the day, plummeted another 15% in after-hours trading. The company lost over $2 billion in market value in a single day. But Kelvin wasn't finished. "Effective immediately, my company is establishing a $50 million fund to compensate victims of airline discrimination. We're creating an industry-wide reporting system for bias incidents. And we're implementing a zero-tolerance policy for any airline that wants to do business with us." He looked directly into the camera, his voice strong and clear. "What happened to me today isn't just about one flight attendant or one airline. It's about a system that sees successful Black people as anomalies to be questioned rather than customers to be served. It's about assumptions that equate skin color with criminality, that assume achievement must be fraudulent, that treat dignity as something to be earned rather than something to be respected." The press conference was broadcast live on CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and every major network. It was streamed on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, It was shared millions of times across social media. Kelvin had transformed his humiliation into a movement. The aftermath was swift and devastating for everyone involved. Melissa Daniels' life unraveled completely. The video of her racist comments went viral, accumulating over 10 million views in the first week. Her name became synonymous with workplace discrimination. Her face became a meme. Her words became a cautionary tale. She was fired from Meridian Airlines, blacklisted from the travel industry, and became unemployable in any customer-facing role. Her apartment lease was terminated when her landlord discovered her identity. Her credit cards were canceled when banks didn't want to be associated with her. She tried to apologize, appearing on a local news station to express regret for her comments. But the apology felt hollow and self-serving. She blamed stress, training failures, and company culture, everything except her own prejudice. "I'm not a racist," she said during the interview, her voice shaking. "I was just following procedures. I was just trying to do my job." But the internet wasn't buying it. The interview only made things worse, generating more memes and more mockery. She became a symbol of everything wrong with customer service, a cautionary tale about the consequences of discrimination. Within 6 months, she'd filed for bankruptcy. Within a year, she'd moved back in with her parents in a small town in Ohio, where she worked part-time at a gas station, one of the few employers who didn't Google her name before hiring. Janet Morrison faced similar consequences. As the supervisor who enabled and encouraged Melissa's discrimination, she was seen as equally culpable. Her 20-year career in the airline industry was over. Her pension was in jeopardy. Her reputation was destroyed. The travel industry blacklisted both women, creating an informal network that ensured they would never work in hospitality again. Their names were added to "do not hire" lists that were shared among airlines, hotels, cruise lines, and travel agencies. They had become cautionary tales, reminders that in an interconnected world, prejudice comes with permanent consequences. But the story wasn't just about consequences. It was about change. Within a week of the incident, 3 major airlines had implemented new diversity training programs. Congress announced hearings on transportation discrimination. The Department of Transportation launched an investigation into bias in the travel industry. Kelvin's story became a Harvard Business School case study on crisis management and social responsibility. It was taught in law schools as an example of how discrimination lawsuits develop. It was referenced in corporate training programs across the country. If you loved this story, hit the subscribe button, type "justice," and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Please share this video to encourage someone.